The dust of the Joseon dynasty swirled around Li Jin's feet as he trudged along the worn path. He was a young scholar, his head filled with the lofty ideals of Confucianism and the burning ambition to pass the state examination. His face, though handsome, was marred by a touch of arrogance, a belief in his own intellectual superiority that often blinded him to the nuances of the world. He sought a renowned scholar to further refine his knowledge. He came upon a small, unassuming tea house nestled beside a copse of bamboo. The sign, weathered by time and the elements, simply read, "Siawa's Tea House." A gentle melody, played on a jiamungo, drifted from within, piquing his curiosity. Thirst and a desire for respite drew him in. Inside, the air was thick with the aroma of brewing tea and a subtle, almost melancholic, fragrance of incense. The tea house was sparsely furnished, yet possessed a refined elegance. Scrolls of calligraphy adorned the walls, and a single, perfectly formed bonsai sat on a low table. Behind the counter, a woman was meticulously preparing tea. This was Siawa. She was older than him, perhaps by 8 years, but her beauty was undeniable. It was a beauty tinged with sadness, a quiet grace that spoke of hardship and resilience. Her hanbok, though simple, was impeccably clean and draped her form with a subtle sensuality. Li Jin felt a stirring within him, a primal attraction that went beyond mere appreciation of beauty. "Welcome, traveler," Siawa said, her voice soft and melodic, like the jiamungo music that still played faintly in the background. "What brings you to my humble tea house?" "I am Li Jin, a scholar on my way to seek further instruction," he replied, puffing up his chest slightly. "I was drawn in by the music and the promise of refreshment." He couldn't help but let his eyes linger on her. Taking in the curve of her neck, the delicate line of her jaw. Siawa poured him a cup of tea, the steam swirling around her hand like a silken scarf. "Rest yourself, scholar. The road is long and arduous." He sipped the tea, the warmth spreading through him. It was exquisite, a blend of flavors he had never encountered before. "This is remarkable," he said, genuinely impressed. "You have a true gift." "It is merely a skill, honed by years of practice," she replied, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment. As the afternoon wore on, Li Jin found himself drawn into conversation with Siawa. He spoke of his studies, his ambitions, his belief in the importance of knowledge and virtue. He subtly, or so he thought, began to steer the conversation towards more personal matters. He complimented her beauty, her grace, hinting at a desire that simmered beneath his polite words. Siawa listened patiently, her expression unchanging. She parried his advances with a gentle smile and a change of subject, steering the conversation back to safer ground. Li Jin, however, was persistent. He was used to getting what he wanted, and he wanted Siawa. The very fact that she resisted him only fueled his desire. He felt the fire in his blood, the need to conquer, to possess. He'd learned all of the classic literature, he believed this would be easy. "You are a woman of extraordinary beauty and refinement," he said. Leaning closer, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. "It seems a waste for such qualities to be hidden away in this remote place. Surely, a woman like you deserves more." Siawa finally met his gaze directly, her eyes holding a depth of understanding that made him feel strangely uncomfortable. "Scholar Li," she said. Her voice still soft but with an undercurrent of steel, "you speak of deserving. But what makes you believe you are the one to offer me more?" He opened his mouth to speak, to reiterate his admiration, his thinly veiled desire, but she raised a hand, silencing him. "Let us play a game, scholar. A game of wits. I will pose a riddle. A verse. If you can complete it with a fitting couplet, then, perhaps we can discuss more. She paused, her eyes twinkling with a hint of amusement. Then, she recited, her voice clear and resonant. "Inian Giorio Chaya, if tonight, fate should intertwine us two." Li Jin's heart quickened. This was it. The opening he had been waiting for. He puffed his chest again, certain of his ability to impress her with his poetic skills. He thought quickly, searching for the perfect words, words that would convey his desire, his passion. He needed something that was impressive, yet not vulgar, something that would show her his poetic ability and that this was indeed destiny. Gidewa naega onol baim ini onol mejumyan, if you and I, this very night, were to be bound by fate's thread. He trailed off, waiting for her reaction. He thought it was rather good, a classic response to her opening line. He saw the subtle, hidden message that he'd weaved in. Siawa, however, simply shook her head, a gentle smile playing on her lips. That does not fit, Scholar Lee. It lacks the necessary balance. He frowned, slightly annoyed. He was not used to being rebuffed, especially in matters of intellect. He tried again, offering another couplet, and another, and another. Each time, Siawa gently rejected his attempts, pointing out the flaws in his logic, the lack of harmony in his words. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the tea house. Li Jin, frustrated and increasingly embarrassed, was forced to admit defeat. He had offered dozens of responses, each one more desperate than the last. He tried to be clever, to be romantic, to be seductive. Nothing worked. He could sense his chances, dwindling with the dimming of the light. I cannot seem to find the fitting words, he confessed, his voice tinged with shame. I concede, Lady Siawa. You have bested me. He huffed, a little annoyed. Siawa's smile remained. But there was a hint of pity in her eyes. She poured him another cup of tea. Drink, Scholar Lee. Perhaps the answer will come to you in the morning. She rose, and went to the back of the tea house, to retire for the evening. He lay awake that night, the riddle echoing in his mind. He tossed and turned, unable to find peace. He couldn't understand where he had gone wrong. His verses had been technically correct, grammatically sound. But they lacked something essential. His arrogance had blinded him. He'd seen her beauty, and had assumed an easy conquest. The rejection stung all the more, because of that. As dawn broke, casting a pale light through the paper windows, Siawa emerged from her private quarters. She found Li Jin sitting at the table, his head in his hands. Did the answer come to you, Scholar Lee? She asked, her voice soft. He shook his head, defeated. No. I am afraid I am not as clever as I thought. Siawa sat down opposite him. The couplet, she said, is this. Gobu Gojio Wankianira, your dead husband would weep in the yellow springs. Li Jin stared at her, stunned. He felt a wave of shame wash over him. He had been so focused on his own desires, his own ego, that he had completely failed to consider Siawa's situation. He had been trying to seduce a grieving widow. A woman who was still mourning the loss of her husband. He had been blinded by lust and arrogance. I am truly sorry, Lady Siawa, he stammered, his face burning with embarrassment. I was foolish and insensitive. I did not think. It is a common mistake, Scholar Lee, she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. To be blinded by one's own desires. But true wisdom lies in understanding the perspectives of others, in recognizing the complexities of life. She continued to look at him, calmly. A man should consider all angles, before speaking. He bowed his head, accepting her rebuke. He had learned a valuable lesson, a lesson far more profound than any he had learned from books. He had been taught humility, and the importance of empathy. It was a brutal, but necessary lesson. He left the tea house that morning, a changed man. He no longer carried himself with the same air of arrogance. His steps were slower, more thoughtful. The world seemed different, seen through new eyes. The lesson he had learned from Siawa had shaken him to his core. He understood, now, that knowledge was more than simply books and poems, it was about understanding the human heart. He continued his journey to Hanseong, the capital city. He found lodgings in a small, crowded inn, the air thick with the smell of sweat and cheap food. The other lodgers were mostly students like himself, all vying for a chance to pass the state examination and secure a position in the government. The competition was fierce, and the atmosphere was tense. The innkeeper, a jovial, rotund man with a perpetually greasy apron, took a liking to Li Jin. He saw in him a certain quiet intelligence, a thoughtfulness that set him apart from the other more boisterous students. One evening, the innkeeper called Li Jin aside. "Young scholar," he said, "I know of a young woman, a widow, who is in need of a husband. She is beautiful, intelligent, and comes from a good family, though her circumstances have been unfortunate." Li Jin, still smarting from his encounter with Xiao was hesitant. He had no desire to repeat his mistakes. But the innkeeper was persistent, and eventually, Li Jin agreed to meet the woman. Her name was Yuna. She was even younger than Xiao, barely 18, but her eyes held a similar sadness, a quiet resilience that spoke of hardship endured. She was strikingly beautiful, with a delicate face and a slender figure. She wore a simple hanbok, but it could not conceal her natural grace and elegance. She was, by all accounts, a prize. Li Jin, however, was cautious. He spoke to her politely, respectfully, keeping his distance. He listened more than he talked, trying to understand her, to see beyond her beauty. Yuna, unlike Xiao, was not reserved. She was open about her situation, about her loneliness, about her desire for companionship and a secure future. She had been married off to an elderly, minor official, who had died shortly after the wedding. She was left with little money and no family to support her. She was desperate, but not without pride. "I do not seek a master, Scholar Li," she said, her voice clear and firm. "I seek a partner, a companion, someone who will respect me and treat me as an equal." Li Jin was impressed by her candor. He saw in her a strength, a spirit that he had not expected. He found himself drawn to her, not just by her beauty, but by her intelligence and her vulnerability. He felt a stirring of something deeper than mere lust, a genuine connection. He could see, perhaps, a life with this girl. But the memory of Xiao, and the lesson he had learned, still lingered. He could not bring himself to fully trust his feelings. He needed to be sure. To test her, to see if she was truly the woman he thought she was. He could not fail again. He decided to use Xiao's riddle, the very riddle that had exposed his own foolishness. It was a risky move, but he felt it was the only way to truly know Yuna's heart. "Lady Yuna," he said, his voice hesitant, "I am honored by your interest. But before we can speak of marriage, I must ask you something. A test, of sorts." Yuna looked at him, her eyes questioning. "A test?" "Yes," he said. "A riddle. A verse. I will recite the first part, and you must complete it with a fitting couplet." He paused, taking a deep breath. Then, he recited Xiao's words. "Inian Giorio Chaya, if tonight, fate should intertwine us two." Yuna listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was clearly intelligent, he could see that. But would she understand the deeper meaning, the hidden implications? Would she be able to see beyond the surface, to the heart of the matter? He held his breath, waiting for her response. Yuna's eyes widened slightly, as if a sudden thought had struck her. She took a moment, considering. She paced slightly, her fingers toying with the edge of her geoggery. It was clear she understood the implication of the verse. It was also clear that this test was unexpected. Li Jin watched her, his heart pounding in his chest. He was prepared for another rejection, another lesson in humility. He had, after all, just asked a woman to consider sleeping with him, on the first meeting. Finally, she stopped pacing and looked directly at him, a faint smile playing on her lips. It was not the same smile as Siawa's. Gentle and knowing. This was a different smile, a smile of understanding, but also of defiance. Gobu Yorio Wankianira, she replied, her voice clear and strong. The dead husband would rejoice in the Yellow Springs. Li Jin stared at her, speechless. He had expected the same answer as Siawa's, the answer that had exposed his own callousness. But Yuna had given him something completely different, something that turned the entire riddle on its head. He felt a jolt, a shock of recognition. He had been so blinded by his previous experience, so determined not to repeat his mistake, that he had failed to see the obvious. Yuna was not Siawa. Her situation was different. She was not a grieving widow, clinging to the memory of her lost love. She was a young woman, widowed before she had even truly lived, seeking a new beginning, a chance at happiness. He had been so focused on the literal meaning of the words, on the idea of the dead husband's disapproval, that he had ignored the context. The human element. He had, once again, allowed his intellect to override his empathy. He tried to use knowledge as a weapon, instead of a tool for understanding. Yuna was watching him, her expression unreadable. He realized that he had been silent for too long, his shock probably evident on his face. He took a deep breath. Trying to compose himself. You are correct, he said, his voice still slightly unsteady. That is a fitting couplet. A very fitting couplet. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. He saw not just her beauty, but her intelligence, her strength, her vulnerability. He saw a woman who had suffered. But who was not broken. He saw a woman who deserved happiness, and who was brave enough to seek it. He had been a fool, again. But this time, perhaps, he had learned his lesson. He took her hand, his touch gentle and respectful. Yuna, he said, his voice filled with sincerity, I have been foolish. I have allowed my past experiences to cloud my judgment. I have been so afraid of making another mistake that I almost made an even greater one. He looked down for a moment, ashamed. I judged you, based on something unrelated. He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a newfound understanding. You have shown me that there is not always one right answer, that life is complex. And that people's circumstances must be considered. You have taught me a valuable lesson, a lesson I will not soon forget. Yuna smiled, a genuine smile this time, a smile that reached her eyes. And perhaps, Scholar Li, she said, her voice soft but firm, you have taught me that not all scholars are blinded by their own intellect. He chuckled, a genuine laugh, a laugh of relief and gratitude. He had been so close to losing her, to pushing her away with his arrogance and his preconceived notions. But she had seen through him, had understood him, had forgiven him. She was remarkable. Yuna, he said, taking both of her hands in his, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Her smile widened, and her eyes sparkled with happiness. Yes, Scholar Li, she said. I will. Their courtship was brief, but filled with a growing affection and respect. Li Jin, chastened by his experiences, was attentive and considerate, treating Yuna with the kindness and understanding she deserved. He listened to her, valued her opinions, and shared his own thoughts and feelings openly and honestly. He learned, slowly but surely, to trust his heart, to let go of his arrogance and embrace the complexities of love. He also, to Yuna's delight, did not neglect the physical aspects of their relationship. Their nights were filled with a passion that was both tender and fierce. A celebration of their newfound love and a release from the loneliness they had both endured. Li Jin discovered that true intimacy was not just about physical pleasure, but about a deep connection of souls, a sharing of vulnerabilities and desires. The descriptions of their nights together, though passionate, were tasteful and avoided explicit vulgarity. focusing on the emotional and psychological connection between them. He had, indeed, learned from both women. Li Jin, spurred on by Yun's unwavering support and belief in him, dedicated himself to his studies with renewed vigor. He no longer sought knowledge for the sake of vanity or ambition, but for the sake of becoming a better man. A man worthy of Yun's love and respect. He finally took the state examination, and passed with flying colors. He was offered a position in the government, a position that would allow him to provide for Yuna and to contribute to the betterment of society. He had achieved his ambition, but it was no longer his sole focus. His happiness was intertwined with Yuna's, and his success was their success. They lived a long and fulfilling life together, raising a family and growing old in each other's company. Li Jin never forgot the lessons he had learned from Xiaohua and Yuna. He became known as a wise and just official, a man who valued empathy and understanding above all else. He had learned that true wisdom was not just about knowledge, but about the ability to connect with others, to see the world through their eyes, and to embrace the complexities of the human heart. He often thought of Xiaohua, and wondered how she was. He hoped she was happy. The riddle, the two seemingly contradictory answers, became a constant reminder of the importance of perspective, of the need to consider all sides of a situation before passing judgment. It was a lesson he carried with him throughout his life, a lesson that guided his actions and shaped his character. He had started his journey as an arrogant scholar, and had become a humble, loving, and wise man. 9,540 characters. 25,596 total characters. Li Jin often reflected on the seemingly paradoxical nature of the two answers he'd received to the same riddle. Xiaohua's, the dead husband would weep in the Yellow Springs, had initially struck him with the force of undeniable truth. It had highlighted his own insensitivity, his disregard for the societal norms and the emotional state of a grieving widow. It was a lesson in propriety, in respecting boundaries, and in understanding the weight of tradition. In the context of Joseon society, with its strict Confucian values, Xiaohua's response was a powerful condemnation of his impulsive behavior. It was designed to shock him into understanding. Yuna's answer, however, the dead husband would rejoice in the Yellow Springs, had opened his eyes to a different kind of truth. It had forced him to confront the limitations of his own perspective, to recognize that the same situation could be viewed through different lenses, depending on individual circumstances. Yuna's response was not a rejection of tradition, but a reinterpretation of it, a recognition that even within the rigid confines of Joseon society, there was room for individual happiness and fulfillment. Her husband, having died so soon after the wedding, would not want her to waste her life alone. He realized that neither answer was inherently right or wrong. They were simply different perspectives, reflecting different realities. The true wisdom lay not in choosing one over the other, but in understanding both, in recognizing the validity of each within its own context. This understanding became the cornerstone of his approach to life, both in his personal relationships and in his official duties. As a government official, Li Jin encountered countless situations where he had to make difficult decisions, balancing competing interests and interpreting complex laws. He often found himself recalling the riddle and its two answers, using it as a guide to navigate the complexities of human affairs. He strived to be fair and just, to consider all sides of an issue before passing judgment, and to temper his intellect with empathy and compassion. He became known for his wisdom and his ability to resolve disputes peacefully. He was respected by his colleagues and admired by the people he served. He used his position not for personal gain, but to improve the lives of others, to promote justice and harmony within his community. He did, after all, have a happy life, and a wonderful wife, and wished the same for others. Yuna, for her part, proved to be not only a loving wife but also a wise and insightful counselor. She was his confidant, his advisor, and his strongest supporter. She helped him to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics, to see through the facades of those who sought to manipulate him, and to remain true to his values. She was the heart, to his mind. Their home became a haven of warmth and laughter, a place where friends and family gathered to share stories and enjoy each other's company. They raised their children to be kind, compassionate, and respectful of others, instilling in them the same values that Li Jin had learned through his own experiences. They wanted children that understood all sides of an argument. Years passed, and Li Jin and Yun-Ah grew old together, their love deepening with each passing day. They had faced challenges and hardships, but their bond remained unbreakable. They had learned from each other, supported each other, and loved each other unconditionally. They had shown that love could be found, even in the darkest of times. One evening, as they sat together on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Li Jin turned to Yun-Ah and smiled. "You know," he said, his voice soft with age and affection, "I often think about that riddle, the one I asked you so many years ago." Yun-Ah smiled back, her eyes twinkling with remembrance. "And which answer do you believe is the true one, my husband?" she asked, playfully. Li Jin chuckled. "I have come to realize," he said, "that both answers are true, and neither answer is true. The truth, like life itself, is complex and multifaceted. It depends on perspective, on circumstance, on the individual heart." He reached out and took her hand, his touch still sending a warmth through her. "And that," he added, "is the greatest lesson I have ever learned." Yun-Ah squeezed his hand, her heart filled with love and gratitude. They sat in silence for a moment, content in each other's presence, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. They had found their truth, their happiness, in each other, and that was all that mattered. They had built a life, based on the wisdom of two women, and the foolishness of a young man.